We're live.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Socialist Action webcast. My name is Elizabeth Weiss. I'm the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action, a member of the NDP Socialist Caucus Steering Committee, a past Secretary of the Toronto and York Region Labour Council, and a retired member of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. We acknowledge that this event is taking place on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island, known as North America. That includes the unceded territories of the Mississauga of the New Credit, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee people in a place called Toronto. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's topic is what is the cause of inflation? Inflation is grabbing headlines worldwide. The cost of living is the number one concern of working people who are already struggling to pay the rent, the mortgage, the electricity bill, and to keep food at the table and gas in the tanks. Tonight's panel features D.T. Cochrane, economist and policy researcher for Canadian for Tax Fairness, Stephen Crozier, a leading Socialist Action member in Vancouver, and Bob MacDiarmid, an SA member in Kingston, Ontario. Gary Porter, our British Columbia organizer and retired chartered accountant, was scheduled to speak tonight, but he took ill. So get well soon, Gary. And of course, we send our best wishes. Now let's hear from our first speaker. D.T. Cochrane is an economist with Canadians for Fair Taxation, a nonprofit group advocating for economic justice through fair taxation. D.T. has a master's in economics and a PhD in social and political thought. His primary research interest is corporate power. He lives in Peterborough with his partner and children. Welcome, D.T.
Thank you very much. So I will start by saying that this presentation is based in part on research that I have done as an economist with Canadians for Tax Fairness, which we refer to as C4TF for short, but I will be presenting my own views as well. So just a bit more about me. I do have a master's in economics. I was trained in mainstream economic theory and techniques, but I had gone into economics because I wanted to understand the actual economy and not the fairy tale economy of mainstream theory. So for my PhD, I did an interdisciplinary program, social and political thought, and I wrote my dissertation on the De Beers diamond cartel during World War II in order to have a focus for an attempt to better understand corporate power. So can we bring up the slides? Excellent. So I was, as mentioned, I live in Peterborough, and we got walloped by the recent storm. I've had some internet issues on and off ever since then. So unfortunately, I'm having to kind of do a jury-rigged presenting via my phone, sent my slides along. So this will hopefully go relatively smoothly. I've titled my presentation, "How do we solve a problem like inflation?" Next slide, please. Okay, so inflation is always a key watchword of dominant economic commentary. There's lots of concern expressed about what's happening with prices. And we've seen a hyper focus during recent months of the pandemic, post-pandemic transition. I'm not sure what exactly to call this period. We're certainly not out of the pandemic. We're not in the thick of the pandemic. So this sort of transitionary period where a lot of things are quote unquote getting back to normal, whatever normal looks like during a climate crisis. And prices are doing a lot of things that are understandably upsetting. So this chart shows the monthly inflation. So February of, say, this year compared to February of last year, how much has the consumer price index increased? So this period of extended inflation, we haven't seen this within this millennia. So since the 2000s, there has been no extended period of this level of price rise, and this is understandably starting to cause some concerns. Unfortunately, it is provoking a lot of frankly unhinged rhetoric about what the causes are and what the solutions should be. So in order to calm ourselves a little bit, we need to put this into a broader context. So next slide. So first, once we look back another 20 years, we can see that Canada has had periods of higher inflation in the past. In the early 80s, we had inflation running above 10% for months on end. I don't want to suggest that we want to return to that, but inflation it was 6.8% in April, although that is high relative to recent years. It's not high once we take a slightly longer perspective. And second, go to the next slide, please. Canada's inflation very closely follows the US. So this shows Canada's inflation in red and the US inflation in blue. And you can see that Canada tracks pretty closely to what's happening in the US. And if you're wondering which country is more responsible for driving that, then there's a lot more that you need to read up on, and I suspect no one actually believes that. So we're very beholden to what's happening to price dynamics within the US. So a lot of the finger pointing at Canadian institutions, at the government, is totally disconnected from reality. That said, that doesn't mean we should totally dismiss inflation concerns altogether. Not least, obviously, there's the question of affordability. And we'll examine some aspects of inflation. But first, I want to note, next slide, please, that we need to understand the difference between inflation and measures of inflation. So inflation refers to a general rise in prices, and the primary measure is the Consumer Price Index, the CPI. And CPI hides an incredible amount of variation in price changes. And if there's enough time, we'll return to this point. But the reason I wanted to make this point was that there's a lot that's going on within what gets described as inflation that gets hidden by this singular focus on the CPI that's making us think that, oh, well, prices across the economy are rising. Yes, there is a general movement, but there's also a lot of variation. Prices of some things are rising a lot more. Prices of some things are actually falling. That ends up being hidden by our focus on the Consumer Price Index. So I want to talk about C4TF's research as it relates to inflation. Next slide, which is a blank slide, so don't panic that it's black. So there's a widely accepted inflation mantra. It shows up almost everywhere that inflation gets discussed. And it is, next slide, too much money chasing too few goods. And this is a monetarist explanation. For those who know monetarism or don't know monetarism, that's the body of thought associated with Milton Friedman. Friedman claimed that inflation was everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon, that it had nothing to do with what was happening in the actual economy. Again, one more thinker totally disconnected from the reality. The slogan of too much money chasing too few goods, it includes both the demand and the supply side. So we have too much money, too much demand, chasing too few goods, too little supply. But it's generally used to claim that there's excessive demand, that we need to remove money from the economy, rather than, well, why is there too few goods? What could we possibly do to increase the supply? This idea of too much money chasing too few goods is pretty key to the nonsense that's being spouted right now by a certain candidate for leadership of the federal conservatives. And rarely stated when saying it's due to too much money chasing too few goods, next slide, please, is who has too much money? Who exactly do we think shouldn't be demanding those goods? And why are there too few goods? So it's not that the slogan of too much money chasing too few goods is untrue per se, but it's facile, it's misleading, and it's not helpful. And there's actually a much simpler explanation for most of what's happening with inflation. Next slide. Corporations that set prices are setting higher prices. So a corporation sets a price of almost everything that we buy at some point along the supply chain. And undoubtedly, for most things we buy, it's many corporations at many points along the supply chain. So I don't want to downplay other material realities that are leading to higher prices. There are production stoppages and supply chain disruptions due to COVID and other disasters. When you have a port that has to shut down and ships have to line up waiting to unload, all of that has to be paid for. That is part of the material reality of inflation. But little or under discussed at the very least, and almost totally absent from the discussion, is the power that corporations have over prices. So corporations, they face prices on their inputs. So perhaps the higher prices that we're seeing as consumers are just corporations passing along their own increased costs. Or are they hiking their prices more than their costs are increasing? In other words, are profit margins increasing? Next slide, which is also blank, so don't be alarmed by that. So C4TF, we looked at profit margins of publicly listed Canadian headquartered companies. And what we found, next slide, from 2002 until 2019, the average profit margin was just under 9%. That's the horizontal dashed line. The thick black line with the circles shows the annual profit margin of those publicly listed Canadian headquartered corporations. And in 2021, we saw a massive jump in profit margin. It almost doubles to just under 16%. So while so many people are still struggling with the pandemic into post-pandemic transition, the corporations are making out like gangbusters. Now, to make sure that this wasn't due to a spike in commodity prices, we looked at just non-commodity companies as well. Next slide. And this is barely less dramatic. So we still see this massive jump, almost doubling of the average profit margin in 2021. Now, there are two possible explanations. The first is some incredible increase in productivity, that the corporations are making more with less. There is no evidence for that whatsoever. The other explanation would be increasing prices. There's lots of evidence of increasing prices, including corporations bragging about it in their calls with investors. I haven't found any examples in the Canadian context, but people have found examples of American CEOs or CFOs telling their investors, we are able to take advantage of the current economic turmoil to jack up our prices. That's what explains the incredible performance that we've had. Once again, reminding us of a point that Noam Chomsky constantly made, that you need to read the business press in order to understand what's really going on, because the people with power are often much more honest in that setting. I encourage anyone who is researching corporations to go and read or listen to the earnings calls, because the CEOs, CFOs are often much more honest about what's going on. Next slide. So mainstream theory, which claims that prices are set at an equilibrium of supply and demand functions, that requires buyers and sellers to be what they call price takers. But next slide. Corporations are price makers, not price takers. Prices are a key mechanism and expression of power within capitalism. And a primary way that obvious power disappears is by claiming that everyone participating in the market is a price taker, because you have to claim that to make your theory work. I went into economics because I wanted to understand corporate power. It seemed obvious to me. I wanted to understand how the economists could say the things that they said. Maybe I was mistaken and they were correct. 2 degrees later, I knew, no, they weren't correct. I was correct. There is corporate power everywhere, and somehow the theory totally makes it disappear. So for a long time in economics, before dominant theory, what is often called neoclassical theory, I often refer to it as equilibrium theory, political economists talked about charging what the market will bear. There was a recognition that those who are providing will charge the highest possible price that they can. Now, understanding why can they charge a specific price requires research, looking into what is determining where they can set this given price. But once you start theorizing equilibrating markets, all of that disappears. Now, that doesn't mean corporations can set prices wherever they want, not least because there's a lot of intercorporate struggle. As I mentioned, corporations face their own prices. So one corporation wanting to raise its prices is actually raising the price that another corporation is going to pay. And we actually saw a surprisingly high profile example of this play out. Next slide. Very recently, people might remember the chip fight, where Loblaws quite publicly refused to accept a price increase from Frito-Lay and removed all of Frito-Lay's chips from their shelves instead of accepting that price increase. The two have reached some sort of resolution. They didn't announce what it actually was. I don't know who blinked or if some compromise was reached. We now have Frito-Lay's chips back on Loblaw's shelves. But why I think it's relevant is because it demonstrates how price is a mechanism of power. This was part of a fight between Frito-Lay's and Loblaw's over the distribution of the revenue that is flowing through these companies connected to people's purchase of chips. And I would suggest that pricing is perhaps the primary expression of capitalist power, and that much of this struggle is intercorporate, and a lot of what happens to us is collateral damage. Where it is not intercorporate is the struggle between workers and corporations, which can also be thought of as a struggle over pricing, as workers insist on a higher price for their labor. This insight into the intercapitalist struggle via prices comes from my PhD supervisor, Professor Jonathan Nitzan, who's a professor at York University and deserves much more credit for the research that he has done into inflation. His main point was that inflation is always redistributionary. This unequal changing of prices means that there are going to be winners and losers. And when we talk about inflation as just this general rise of prices, that disappears. All of the collateral damage from who wins and who loses disappears. And we need to understand that much better if we're going to have the right policy solutions to deal with inflation, and not the ham-fisted, hammer to the forehead solutions that are being suggested, like cutting government spending or hiking interest rates. Next slide. So yeah, I think I have the time. So returning to this point, that we need to understand the difference between inflation and measures of inflation. The primary reason to worry about inflation, as I mentioned, is affordability. If prices rise without a commensurate rise in wages, then we can afford less. It's just that simple. Unfortunately, our measures of inflation and the effects on affordability are very crude and very poorly understood. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, it hides a lot of variation in price changes. Some prices rise much more than the CPI indicator, some prices fall. For more on this, I have to direct you to the work of Blair Fix. He did a blog post called The Truth About Inflation that looks at many of the problems, particularly focused on this issue of all of the variation that disappears within the CPI. Next slide, please. And this chart actually comes from Blair's work. What it shows, the thick black line is the US official CPI. And then all of those colored lines are individual commodities that are part of the US Consumer Price Index. And what you can see is that since January 2020, you have some commodities that have risen in price almost or over 60%, and you have some commodities that have fallen in price by almost 60%. This is an incredible spread that means the impacts on us and our day-to-day lives are very, very different. What are the prices that are actually increasing? How is that affecting what we can actually afford? All of this should be part of the discussion about how we're going to deal with inflation. So I also want to mention that in order to construct CPI, statistical bodies construct a basket of typical consumption, and that hides variation in consumption patterns between the young and the old, urban, rural, rich, poor, and also actual prices are adjusted for changes in quality. So what does this mean? Next slide. So this shows the price change from April 2011 for all goods, the CPI, and the price for computers. And it shows that the price for computers has fallen by 30%. That hasn't been my experience of buying computers over the last decade, but what this is a result of is Statistics Canada adjusting the price of computers for the fact that computers can do a lot more than they could in 2011. So this is an artificial reduction for higher quality. And this also hints at other ways that corporations effectively raise prices without actually raising prices. They can reduce product quality, they can reduce product quantity, and they can direct consumers to higher margin products. Next slide. So I'm going to wrap up. How do we solve a problem like inflation? To solve a problem like inflation, we need to know much more about the problem than CPI tells us, and certainly than all the pundits talking about inflation tell us. Next slide. We need research. This might seem a little self-serving since I am a researcher, but we need to know which prices are rising and why. Why are those prices rising? But effective research also needs more. Next slide. Transparency. We need more information about corporate finance and pricing practices. Our analysis looked at Canadian headquartered companies, but it couldn't look at all of the corporations that Canadians encounter because many of those corporations aren't Canadian. And we don't know how much revenue, how much profit, how much taxes those corporations pay in Canada. Next slide. We need to raise corporate income taxes. The corporate income tax rate was slashed under what we've learned are false pretenses, and raising the corporate income tax rate is an important and necessary check on corporate power. Next slide. We need an excess profits tax. Government, to achieve a just transition, is going to have to spend. We are basically needing a wartime-like economy, and we have a trickle-up economy. The money that government spends is going to end up in corporate coffers via profit margins, via interest, and excess profits tax is a way to make sure that unearned profits continue to circulate within the economy. Next slide. We need to keep all options on the table, most prominently price controls. We need to recognize that there is a role for price controls. Many prices are already being controlled, but they're controlled by corporations for the interests of capitalists. They should be controlled by public institutions for the public interest. And really getting to the root of this, next slide, please. We need to reinvigorate debates about just prices. Getting prices right is a long-standing ethical problem that we once took seriously. It is about who deserves to get what? Let's accept that the problem of prices was not eliminated by supposedly free markets, that prices are a mechanism of power. And let's look at where we think prices should actually be, because they're not being set in some just, fair way. In order to achieve that will require serious, actual hard work. Last slide. So thank you very much for listening along with this. Please go to taxfairness.ca. You can sign up for our newsletter and other mailings. You can follow C4TF on Twitter at FairTaxCanada. I'm on Twitter at DT Cochrane. Feel free to email me at dtcochrane@taxfairness.ca. And please, if you can, donate. Canadians for Tax Fairness is a small organization. There's so much research that needs to be done on corporate power and tax fairness. We'd love to be able to do more, but as with most things, it requires a bit more funding. So if you are able to, please consider donating. Thank you very much. You can end the slideshow.
Okay, thank you very much, DT. Our next speaker is Stephen Kozier. He is the former president of the New Westminster and District Labour Council, a retired college teacher who actually have taught for over 30 years in Canada and abroad. And he was heavily involved in his union, also being the vice president of negotiations at the Douglas College. And he's also a leading member of Socialist Action in BC. Welcome, Stephen.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thank you, DT, as well. Very informative talk. I think it sort of dovetails fairly nicely into what I'm going to start off with. First, I want to say that I'm on the unceded traditional territory of the Semiahmoo people and the broader Coast Salish people here in BC. Speaking about capitalism and inflation, capitalism is by its nature inflationary. What you're looking at is profit, even if it is at that 9%, over and above labor and material costs. And unless, of course, those things get reinvested into the goods and services, it's going to cause inflation. And much like inflation and the way that it should be more detailed so that we understand it better, it's the same thing with this with profits and where it is that they go, which primarily go to the 1% and actually the 0.1%. So it means that wealth and power are being concentrated, and this is allowing for inflationary practices like some of the ones that you pointed out right now with corporate greed. So money without the corresponding wealth in goods and services produced, this unearned income causes inflation. So we have an example, and I found it interesting with your chart where it showed that really in 2020, and so the inflation was actually going down for many reasons, which we won't go into right now. But at that time, top 20 billionaires in Canada for that first year of COVID gained $28 billion, added $28 billion to their already enormous wealth. This is going to have an effect as the economy continues, but this is while the real economy was actually dormant mostly. So goods and services were not increasing. So this is a reflection of the financialization of our economy and what has happened right now. And that false economy of that financialization has continued. So what we have is money making money rather than making wealth, which is really measured with goods and services within our economy. We need a system change, basically, and that system change is socialism. And from those, socialists have a saying that from those according to their ability to those according to their need. And I've turned that around and said that, or actually sort of captured it for capitalism. And basically in capitalism, you have from those according to their ability to those according to their greed. And this is really something that we have to overcome. We have to make this system change. So at present, as you pointed out, there's a lot of profiteering. This is gouging from consumers and workers to the point of what the market will bear. As that economic and political power is more and more concentrated on fewer hands, we're going to have a worse problem. And so this is a cause of inflation. I want to give credit to Gary Porter, who's contributed a great deal to what I will be saying now. So the policies of the U.S. and its allies, including Canada, are stoking inflation and undercutting the purchasing power of the wages workers earn. And this transfers a large amount of the cost of the economy and kinetic war to us and our families. This is not a demand pull inflation, which is something that you pointed out. This is not many dollars for social programs and wages pulling up prices. Government subsidies for workers during COVID were merely a replacement for part of the lost wages from shutdown, illness, and quarantine. There are a few cost of living adjustments or COLA clauses in Canadian wage contracts, and few wage gains that surpass productivity gains. In fact, we know that since 1980, there have been huge productivity gains, but wages have stagnated. Anyone who says workers must reduce wage demands to fight inflation is either not too bright or telling a barefaced lie, and I'd say it's a bit of both. The bulk of the COVID subsidies went to businesses to support continuing operations and employment. However, they took the money and laid off hundreds of thousands of workers anyway, and invested that money in financial assets to drive up their stock prices. Yet there will be a call for austerity for workers, not for corporate shareholders and their executives. We must understand how wrong this is and forcefully oppose it. It's the misreading of the problem and therefore a misunderstanding of the solution. A similar thing happened to big subsidies paid to save the banks and brokerage houses in the 2008 mortgage securities fiasco. That money did not end up in building or refurbishing factories or creating jobs. Some of it went to pay massive bonuses to corporate executives, but most went into speculative offshore and out of tax range investments. Workers lost their houses and the economy lost its mind. These massive speculative infusions reflected absence of opportunity for profitable investment in the real economy, where marginal profits were shrinking and deindustrialization of America had largely been completed. Decisions in the US and Canada about investments are made in private boardrooms by billionaires without any reference or concern for the needs of the working class of the whole society and the world economy as a whole. This massive increase in financial and other speculative assets has been causing high levels of asset inflation for years. That's why stock markets are insanely high and why an overvalued Twitter with a market capitalization of $36 billion is bought out by Musk, the world's #1 billionaire. And according to Gary, he's a bit of a jerk. I think we might get agreement for $44 billion, while nothing new is being created and quite likely jobs will be lost. But recently, inflation has begun to surge in areas directly raising cost of living for the working class. I would say those things are raising if we take a look at it, because these are necessities for people: housing, transportation, food, medicine. These are all basic needs at the very least. Where is this new surge coming from? It arises chiefly from a series of measures imposed by U.S. imperialism on American workers, the global South, and in its NATO allies, bolster the hegemony and resist the tendency of rate of profits to decline on the global basis. I'm going to skip this next part. There's a part here now about sanctions, boycotts, and blockades, which I would say are acts of war without the munitions. And so some of the, Gary has actually listed a bunch of examples of this: banning on arms-related exports, control over dual-use technologies, restrictions on economic assistance, financial restrictions, so many different things that have been imposed on countries. And these sanctions cause shortages of basic goods. Okay, am I having an internet problem?
You went out for a second, but we can hear you again.
Okay, I just saw the message there. So, okay, so these things make prices, make things more expensive, and so there is a price increases for people. The war production is also a cause of inflation. And if you, sorry, I shouldn't get distracted. If you take a look at and that's an example of where it boosts, in a sense, capital markets, but it certainly does not create goods and services that are good for people. And so a lot of the things, are created, but they're actually for destruction of human beings, not for advantages. Monopolies, of course, under capitalism, economic powers that limit supply and raise prices are causing inflation. And this has become a massive problem in industrial competition. The U.S. leads the race to financial rentier capitalism, and this path leads to zero government, literally, and monopoly rent on everything. So healthcare in the U.S. is an example of how this operates. It's like your money or your life. There's a whole range of goods and services that are affected, inadequate housing supply, but also development profits and speculation lead to sharply raises in home and prices and income. Oil cartels, of course, are also raising prices in that area. We see that. Battery-operated cars are priced too high. Again, a lot of it has to do with pricing. It does not have to do with demand push. In part, of course, Elon Musk is making his money from these highly priced cars, electric cars. Government corporate bailouts, as was mentioned above, can also cause inflation if it's not, if it doesn't recirculate in the real economy where workers live, and speculation on real estate or other commodities, so give rise to super profits. So just in concluding, a few things. Of course, there is tax the rich to get rid of some of these injustices. Stop war production. I was going to mention, again, the way that we measure our economy. Exxon Valdez is considered one of the most profitable oil tanker trips ever. The reason being that it generated a lot of measured activity in the economy. We need to, so obviously we're measuring our economy the wrong way. No more bailouts, tax breaks, and subsidies for corporations. We have to decommodify housing. Right now, housing is or development, you might say, is not serving the housing demand. It's serving the investment demand. Nationalize and phase out oil and gas. And of course, workers need cost of living adjustment clauses in their contract. So I don't see how these measures will be fulfilled under capitalism. And that's why I say we need socialism. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Now we will hear from Bob MacDiarmid. He is a longtime labor union activist, a member of the NDP Socialist Caucus, and a veteran of Socialist Action in Kingston, Ontario. Welcome, Bob.
Bob, you're muted.
Yeah, got it. Okay, sorry. Yeah, thanks. Great talk so far. I wanted to zoom out and talk about capitalism, the changes in capital in general. But there's one thing that no one talks about with inflation, and that's the drought. And again, the third world gets shafted again. You know, if other conditions had been normal, a loss of Ukrainian wheat would have been manageable. But with economic fragility, war, climate change, nothing is normal. Global food prices, you know, food, housing, and food and housing are the main concerns around inflation. They started rising before the pandemic. And the drought started in 2019, the worst in world history. Parts of North and South America, Africa, Asia, and prices went up shortly after that drought started. We heard about the last year's drought in the prairies that reduced wheat and soybean, legume crops and others, and drought, fires, and floods in BC and California, affecting Canada's main agriculture areas. The same in the American Midwest. India and Pakistan, 50 degrees centigrade heat right now. India is a major wheat producer. Like, it doesn't produce enough for its population, so it still imports, but it's a major producer, and that's wiped out at 50 degrees. Pakistan's mango harvest is gone. So blistering heat and storms have devastated crops and threatened the lives of thousands of small farmers in the global south. Horn of Africa countries such as Somalia are experiencing the worst drought in 40 years and high temperatures. And recently, when the rain comes out, the hard-packed dry dirt just causes flooding and it's breeding swarms of locusts. Coffee is going to be more expensive next year because Brazil's coffee harvest has been wiped out by climate change. The other thing is, energy prices have been rising since before the war, prompting many fertilizer producers to slow or close their factories. As fertilizer costs soar, many farmers around the world are using less, contributing to smaller harvests. Supply chain, they say war is how to teach Americans geography. Supply chains sort of teach us all the components in the commodities we use, but industrial fertilizer is produced with gas. They heat the raw materials up to a gas, changing the chemical structure. So yeah. I'm trying to skip a bit because China's winter wheat harvest is a big producer to it. Who knows? It's probably not going to be very successful. And the other thing about Ukraine's wheat, it goes to particular places. It goes to, on contract to North Africa and the Middle East. And with the wheat harvests around the world, instead of price contracts, they're going to have to buy on spot markets, which are in dollars. With the dollars rising, it's going to make more expensive, and the prices are more expensive. So the third world is going to face a crisis of malnutrition and famine. They caused none of the problems. They didn't cause inflation. They haven't caused climate change, but they always get the shaft. And the World Food Program estimates about 49 million people face emergency levels of hunger. About 811 million go to bed hungry every night. Yeah. So, yeah. Well, we talk about climate change. We're at a crossroads right now. I mean, I just got the Guardian. The front story was the big oil majors are planning massive investments in new oil infrastructure to lock in CO2 for decades. At 1% average global warming, we've got climate chaos. I've just described the drought. So we're really at a crossroads. Either we stop that, or green solutions, or we're at present rates we're headed for 3%. Imagine at 1% what's happening, and let's go to 3. Okay, that's a big topic, but I think I'll switch back to my main. Okay, so I really appreciate the first presentation. It was really good because corporate pricing and monopoly pricing have a big effect. But there's a lot of stuff going on in the background. From one of the charts in Detail's presentation, the neoliberal reaction to the 70s stagflation crisis, the revolution of the world in a negative way, but the inflation only lasted 2 years. It was probably more of an excuse than a cause of the neoliberal counter-revolution. And for decades, the major companies have been trying to raise inflation to the 2% target. The pandemic and the war have changed that. And I think I can skip some of this, but the standard response is interest rates, and they don't tell you that interest rates are just to crush labor. I mean, they slow the economy, people get laid off. That's a function of interest rate hikes. Well, plus it makes borrowing more expensive. But it will not mean curbing the bumper profits of energy companies and other monopolies. So it's when the rich get rich, they say it's growth. When the workers' wages go up, they say it's inflation. So it's got nothing to do with wage inflation. I mean, there's been militancy and some increased wages, but they're way below the rate of inflation now. So you're still losing purchasing power. And I think it's been covered too. Conservatives probably ever are bad at blaming government spending in 2008 and during the pandemic, which kept this system going on life support. And monitors have been saying for years that government spending would cause inflation, and it never happened. Friedman's monetarism should just die, along with neoclassical economics. Where I would disagree a bit is, apart from housing and corporate price rate, most of the inflation is imported. I just mentioned food prices are up because of climate catastrophe and rising energy prices. Energy prices are set globally on futures and increase the price of most foods. It's amazing how much, well, oil is transportation, but it's also in most of our products, plastics, our polyester, clothes, everything. So that's an external. Okay, so I'd like to go into a bit into the political economy of the crisis. Financialization came around because in the 70s, profits tanked. I mean, capitalists will invest in new industry producing goods and services if they can make a profit. They found that it was a lot more profitable to invest in financial rigging than in producing goods. I mean, there was intense competition from Europe and Japan, just overproduction in cars, and profits tanked. And financialization was the solution. I could go a lot into that, but it's kind of long. So for 3 decades under neoliberalism, a defining feature of the world economy is its ability to churn out more goods at even lower prices. The entry of 1 billion workers from China from the Soviet bloc, coupled with falling trade barriers and hyper-efficient logistics, produced an age of abundant, cheap commodities. But this model of accumulation is now in question, especially as a result of Putin's folly in Ukraine. But the broken supply chains are an essential feature of the economy. And there's a contradiction. The supply chains, if you're going to offshore industries, you need the supply chains to get the products from the cheap labor countries to the imperial core. So the supply chains have been designed for maximum efficiency and profit. Left to business, the profit motive dominates, and the supply chains would be rebuilt in a year or so. But geopolitics could change that. So what happens to supply chains are unknown. But any kind of onshoring, friendshoring they're talking about now, just supply chains with friendly countries, shortening or disruption of change would raise prices and inflation. With the stagnation of wages under neoliberalism, the working class has only got by with cheap commodities from Asia, low interest rates, and debt. So higher commodity prices and higher interest would be a serious problem and disrupt politics. Brace for a world of lower growth, higher prices, and increased volatility. And the years after the financial crisis and the Great Recession of 2008 were already marked by a sluggish recovery with low levels of profitability and dismal levels of productive investment. As you read the
1 minute, Bob.
Okay. Okay, I think I'll just wrap up there. But there's a choice. I mean, I agree with DK, but you'd have to change the government. Think of Pandora, Panama Papers. Other countries have people in jail over that tax avoidance. Nothing in Canada. Most solutions are, yeah, I agree with policy choices. Housing needs to be nonprofit. Affordable housing will not be built by a free market. It needs to be public housing. You're gonna have to change the government. So, yeah. Well, a major obstacle to socialist policies or progressive policies is the bureaucratic leadership of the unions, the NDP, the only mass organizations we have. Socialist action is at the forefront of workers' action movement to kick out the jams in the labor movement, the same in the Socialist Caucus and the NDP. No individual or party can accomplish this task alone. That is why socialist action is committed to the tactic of the united front. For that reason, Socialist Action helped to initiate the Municipal Socialist Alliance in Toronto and Peel, and both Socialists in Vancouver. We participate in United Front campaigns such as the Canadian DBS Coalition, Canadian Peace Network, the Canadian Network on Cuba, plus anti-poverty, anti-fascist, pro-feminist, pro-choice, pro-queer, pro-indigenous actions. The challenges are used. I mean, there's a lot of angst in the air now because people know how bad it is, but the choice, you can sort of fold your hands and hide in a hole, or you can fight back, and it's a lot more rewarding to fight back. So if you're interested in joining or working with us, just contact Socialist Action. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bob. So now we're going to go to our technical producer for the first three questions. And when he will put them in the chat, and he will also read them. And it will start with the first round will be Stephen, then Bob, and then DT. And you will each have up to 5 minutes to answer 1, 2, or 3 questions of your choice. Dave?
Yep. The first question comes from Hans Modlich. Surely quantitative easing, also known as printing money by state banks in synchronism during the pandemic, is the major driver of current inflation worldwide. Please comment. The second question comes from Judy Kosh. Does higher prices benefit the ruling class? And the third question comes from Alex Padilla. What is a better measure of inflation?
Okay, each have up to 5 minutes, and we'll start with Stephen.
Okay, so well, I'll start with the first one, and I might get a chance, I think, at the second, and I do believe that DT would be better qualified to answer the third. When it comes to quantitative easing, I mean, this is not the first time that this has been done, and there is a thing called modern monetary theory that would say that quantitative easing sort of never leads. No, I shouldn't say that. Not that it never leads to inflation, but if I look at money as being the sort of grease of the wheels of the economy, and so if you're putting money into the economy and creating the goods and services that economy needs, then you're not going to have inflation as such. You're actually going to be doing the things that need to be done. Right now, we've got lots of those things that need to be done. The environmental crisis and the housing crisis are two of them, and this is where money should be poured into those areas so that we could prevent the future collapse of our environment and our economy. It's not being done. So quantitative easing can do that. And of course, you're probably familiar with Seth Klein's book, A Good War, where he talks about this being used during the Second World War, and the types of things that are necessary and work very effectively there. When the government got into building housing and actually did provide or get involved in the economy to a much greater degree than they're in now, since neoliberalism started in the 1980s. This gave rise to the greatest economic boom that the world has ever seen. So I think, again, it's sort of like if you're giving that money, if that money is going to corporations and corporate executives and owners of corporations, then it's not going to the right place. But governments can create money. If you have a fiat currency and a currency that is not, that you don't have to use gold if you owe money someplace, it's not tied to anything, then you can use money appropriately to serve your economy and your people. And Canada is in that position. Right now, what we're doing is we're allowing banks to create money, private for-profit banks, and that is necessarily inflationary. Going back to the housing markets, here in the Lower Mainland, I've talked to a couple of developers. Banks demand that developers show a 15% profit margin before they will support developments here in the Lower Mainland. we looked at those inflation charts, and 9% was kind of like lower, and then it's been driven up to 15%. Well, that is the bottom rate of profit that banks are demanding from developers before they can move ahead with a project. If we had a public bank, which the Canadian Union of Postal Workers is advocating, if we had financial services that were there to serve the public rather than serve profit, we'd be a lot further ahead. So yes, there are problems with quantitative easing, but I don't think, and this is something that was mentioned in some of the talks, some of the points in the talks, this is not the cause of inflation at this point. That money was used to support workers so that they could continue living. And there's no indication, at any rate, that it caused this inflation. It's profit gouging. That's what it is. Do higher prices benefit the ruling class? Yes, they do, Judy, because the ruling class is setting the higher prices. So I'll leave it at that. And thank you very much for the questions.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Bob?
We can't seem to hear you, Bob. You don't appear to be muted.
Okay, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, sorry. On quantitative easing, we've had an empirical test. I mean, there was something like $27 trillion pumped by the U.S. Fed into the economy. But, that goes mostly to other banks. The system was in total crisis with a liquidity freeze. I mean, that's like the motor oil in your car freezing up. It blows up. It was absolutely, but it went into finance.
You're cutting out, Bob. We've lost you.
Okay.
Muted. Oh.
Okay, how far did I get? Well, just to repeat, $27 trillion went into the company after 2008, and all the deficit hawks were saying there'd be massive inflation. It never happened. It went into bailing out banks, and it went into the finance industry. I mean, they call it the fire: finance, insurance, and real estate. That's one of the reasons the real estate is becoming more expensive, because it's an asset class for financiers. But more than that, QE and low interest rates were the weapon of choice, because it was the only way in which recovery after 2008, however slow and anemic, could be generated without changing the economic model that has served the rich and powerful so well over the three decades. I mean, the rich are getting richer, as we all know, and the workers are getting poorer. That's built into the economic model. But the side effects of that would have been, the rollicking stock markets and rip-roaring house prices. And there's a contradiction in interest rates as a cure for inflation. Like, I think it's just pointless, because I would argue that most of the inflation, apart from housing and profit rate, is external. Capitalism is a global system, and oil is a place globally. The food that I've mentioned, the supply chains, neon gas. Cars are expensive because they can't get microchips. Neon gas, Ukraine, 2 factories in Ukraine produce 40% of the world's neon, which is crucial for microchips. One in Mariupol, which is probably dust. The other one's in Odessa. So yeah, I don't agree on the quantitative easing. It was a necessary medicine, but that whole model blew up in 2008. And the fact that crisis morphed into an economic crisis, to a sovereign debt crisis. Look at Sri Lanka or Lebanon, and many others. And now we have a political economic crisis. On Judy's question, the rich hate uncertainty, and it goes back to the neoliberal revolution came around after the stagflation crisis. Unions were strong. They had COLA clauses, cost of living clauses, that would automatically kick in as inflation rose. And the millions and trillions of the rich are losing purchasing power every day. So they hate high inflation, like 3-4% is okay. But there was a total reaction to that. I mean, the 60s, 70s, there's a lot to know there. Like the Soviet Union still existed as a counterweight to the US. You had the anti-war movement, all kinds of, radical movements. They thought they were losing control and the economy was going to hell. The US turned from a trade surplus country to a deficit country at that time. And the rich reacted with all the stuff we know of deregulation. They wanted to smash the labor movement. That's what neoliberalism was all about. They wanted to smash the labor movement, and they succeeded. So at that point, they don't like inflation. It's hard on everybody, but it's particularly hard if you got a bank account of $1 trillion and it's losing a couple million every day.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Your time is up. Now we'll go to DT.
Thank you for the questions. The first one on quantitative easing. I largely agree with Stephen and Bob. Quantitative easing is not the cause of inflation. Quantitative easing was primarily an asset swap. It was just a way of providing liquidity to the big banks to make sure that they could meet their own debt obligations. And so it was the central banks taking onto their books what were relatively unliquid or less liquid assets and providing the banks with dollars that, as Bob mentioned, they mostly were just trading amongst themselves. It was a way to keep the system moving, and I'm not on board with for-profit banks dominating the system. If we are as generous as we can be in what we understand profit to be for, it supposedly drives innovation and productivity. I have no idea what socially beneficial innovations for-profit banks have generated. I don't see any reason to allow profit in the financial system. One of our most robust not-for-profit sectors are credit unions. Credit unions can provide basically all of the services that banks do, and they return their profits to their members. Are credit unions perfect? No, far from it. But they demonstrate every day that they can do exactly what the for-profit banks do without skimming the profit off of the top. So I don't see why we shouldn't shift to entirely a credit union system. The credit unions would still need this sort of asset management by a central bank system, but also think about our central bank. Our central bank operates as a not-for-profit, and you can criticize the specific policy choices that they make, but they operate very successfully without having a profit motive in place. So you find non-profit, not-for-profit operation throughout the economy, often in areas where for-profit enterprises need some form of stability. They would certainly not want a for-profit seeking central bank because really it would eat their lunch. So they want a not-for-profit there to kind of make sure that there's a level playing field for the rest of them to operate on. Do higher prices benefit the ruling class? I agree with Bob that it's a yes and no situation. When you look among corporations, I mentioned my professor, Jonathan Nitzan. One of his central concepts is dominant capital. So looking at the biggest, largest, most powerful corporations against the corporations that kind of make up the periphery, and generally higher levels of inflation benefit those more dominant corporations more than those at the periphery. What is a better measure of inflation? I'm not saying we should get rid of CPI, but we need to be drilling down, and we need our media to drill down and look beyond just the headline level of inflation. And we need more transparency about how this thing is actually constructed. The fact that we have a statistical body that creates a basket of goods for the average consumer that totally obliterates the differential consumption that we all participate participate in that means different people are affected differently. There has been some research that has shown that in periods of higher inflation, it disproportionately hits the poor rather than the rich. So when you look at the different consumption baskets of these groups, you see different experiences of inflation. We need much more of that type of thing.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we will go back to our producer again, and this time we will be having 4 questions. And you will be given 6 minutes to answer. And the lineup will be Bob, DT, and Stephen. So, Dave?
The first question comes from Daniel Franklin. Are you suggesting that prices like rent should be controlled with set yearly increases and a mechanism to get a higher increase through a justifiable request? The second question is from Ellen Ramsey. Will the Bank of Canada's intervention on rates bring down inflation? Had they done this before during another period of inflation? Did it work? The third question comes from Barry Weisletter. In the first quarter of this year, the top 5 oil companies reported profits of $35 billion US, a jump of over 300% compared to a year ago. Canadian Natural Resources more than doubled first quarter profit to $3.1 billion. By expropriating these giants, what could a workers' government fund in the interest of the majority? The fourth question is, people are starting to say we should look and study how China does things. Do you know how China deals with inflation?
Okay, so you have 6 minutes, and we'll start with Bob, then DT, then Stephen. Bob?
On the housing question, housing is really complicated, but the short answer, David Oliver in the Star had a column that just what I think. The problem is not affordability in general. The problem is not supply, it's affordability. And the private market will build luxury condos, will build monster homes. They will never build affordable public housing for, gig workers, the disabled, minimum wage workers. Even people making a decent income, like teachers, cannot afford a house in Toronto. It'll never happen from the private market. It needs to be public money. The way it was done up until the 70s, think of the Labour government in England post-war. They were heavily in debt. They built council housing, millions of council houses that were publicly owned and affordable. On housing, it needs to be public housing, public affordable housing. The Bank of Canada on rates bring down inflation. Boy, the stagflation crisis in the 70s is really important to learn about. I mean, Volcker in the States jacked interest rates up to, I think, 20%. He killed inflation, but he also killed wages. He killed the economy. I mean, it's a small price to pay, but yeah, they did it. It sure worked. It did what they wanted. It's like I say, they never tell you raising interest. They say we're on slow inflation with the interest rates. They don't tell you that there's an attack on labor. There's other ways to deal with it. But anyway. They've done it. They'll do it again. China is different. It's not the Stalinist system of one man deciding everything. They're really smart. Like whatever you think of China, repressive, capitalist, whatever, they're really smart. They're totally familiar with Western economics and Marxist economics. They've got party think tanks. They've got university think tanks. They've got everything. So I don't think they've had much inflation. Well, no, I don't think they've had inflation, and they would deal with it a lot smarter than we do here. Where here the profit motive rules, and they'll protect profits any way they can. Okay, I think that's enough. Okay, signing off.
Okay, so we'll move to DT.
I don't have any suggestion for exactly what price controls should look like, what the process of them should be. There are a lot of people who have expertise in price controls, and they work for corporations. And I suspect that a lot of them would prefer that their expertise go towards benefiting the communities that they live in rather than the shareholders that own the corporation that they happen to work for. We used to have a lot more expertise in price controls because it was one of the mechanisms of making sure that we could fund a war economy. It was recognized that we can't turn to the private sector to take on this war. It will have to be driven by public institutions, and we'll need to use every tool at our disposal, including making sure that prices are not running away, to successfully conduct this war while also having an economy that can support people back on the home front. So I know there are a lot of people with technical expertise who can devise a system that will function. Would it be without pains? No, but it at least would be responsive to public institutions. Bank of Canada's interventions. Yeah, I think this is an interesting question, because in as much as the raising of interest rates don't harm the economy, they will be ineffective. And in as much as they do harm the economy, they will be effective. As Bob said, no one really wants to talk about the mechanism by which raising interest rates actually works to slow down inflation. One part of it is to undermine workers, and a means by which they do so is to effectively push a lot of more marginal businesses out of business. So you have businesses who have much less pricing power, who are already facing rising costs of their inputs, and now suddenly a new cost is rising. It's more expensive for them to turn over their debt. If they're operating on a very slim margin, that can be the difference between being able to continue to work or failing. And so now if they fail, all of those workers who were receiving that income, they're all now out of a job. Those workers, they were spending their income on into the economy in other places. So now you have all of the businesses who had that as some of their revenue losing that revenue. That loss of revenue might be enough to put them out of business. And so you have this trickle-on effect of driving businesses out of business, driving workers out of jobs. So yes, you're reducing demand. You're reducing demand primarily by the people who were the last to have that demand, because we also know that there's a last in, first out phenomenon. And so people from traditionally marginalized communities are the ones who will be the first to become unemployed. So harming people from communities of color, harming people with visible disabilities, that will be part of the mechanism by which the Bank of Canada might be successful. And so when people are suggesting that we need to be jacking up interest rates, they need to be answering to the people who they think shouldn't be demanding goods in our economy. Not only will you have these businesses laying people off, well, now there's also going to be a fire sale on all of their assets. Who's going to buy up those assets? It's going to be the most powerful corporations who aren't having to borrow from the banks in order to fund themselves. So there's going to be greater corporate concentration. So this will all be in the interest of a certain subset of the capitalist class. Some will be harmed by it and some will benefit by it. I talked about how there is a lot of intercorporate struggle. There are a lot of differential interests at play within the capitalist economy, even among the ruling class. And I think it really behooves us to identify where those different interests exist to try to leverage them against each other. We do not want a hike in interest rates in order to bring inflation under control. And there are certain segments of the capitalist class who don't want a hike in interest rates. How can we strategically align ourselves to make sure that this outcome that will harm all of us, harm the people who can least afford to be harmed, how do we make sure that doesn't come to pass? To Barry's question about expropriating the profits from the oil companies, the first point I would like to make is that for, as mentioned, fiat currency governments, they don't need that money in order to fund the things that need to be funded. There is lots that the federal government needs to fund in order to achieve a just transition. It's already been mentioned that fiat currency governments literally spend money into existence. So they can spend that money wherever they want. The reason why you tax these profits is to make sure that the money continues to flow in the economy. It's not so much that we need rich people's money, it's that we need rich people not to have that money. In finance, the world of finance, they refer to huge cash piles that corporations control as dry powder. I think that's a perfect metaphor because it can explode in unpredictable ways that we don't even know what the harm of that could be. So the rich who acquire all of these financial assets that are useful to the rest of us, they shuffle it offshore in order so they can maintain control of it. And what we need is for them not to maintain control of it, because it just drives all of the negative forces that their inordinate power causes. And I don't know enough about China in order to usefully weigh in on that.
Okay, thank you, DT. Stephen?
Yeah, well, I think some very good answers to these questions have already been offered. I think in a certain way that taking a look at Daniel Franklin's question here, so this is kind of like a band-aid after the fact. And I think that there are better ways of dealing with things like the price of housing. And so I agree largely with what Bob said here. And just using White Rock and British Columbia as an example, there is enough housing here. We actually had a housing needs report done in White Rock, reflected a housing needs report that was done by the Union of BC Municipalities, and that is that there is enough housing built already. The problem is that it's not the housing that we need. It's too expensive. It was built for profit. I said before that the bottom for the profit is 15%. You need to show that you'll make a 15% profit before you can go ahead with the project. That's imposed upon developers by banks, and that's the bottom. So how much is that adding? And so it means that where they're going to go, they're also holding on to land until it is most profitable for them to build. That's another thing. And another element here is that 40% of the new builds in British Columbia are bought by speculators. They're bought by people in the real estate industry. So you've got like two or three things making prices higher than they should be. We absolutely need the government to get into housing. Again, as DT was saying, there's no problem with the government creating money, and it's not going to be inflationary. Actually, what we'll have is, houses that people can afford, or homes that people can afford to live in. So with that question, now going on to Ellen's workers' board. Yes, again, I think it's been pointed out that raising interest rates, is going to disproportionately hurt those that have financial flexibility or space. The poor people, the workers, are going to suffer much more. And again, we can use the housing market as an example. People are going to lose their homes. People who need their homes to live in are going to lose their homes. And again, as DT was saying, there's money out there. Michael Hudson came to talk to us. It's got to be 5 or 6 years ago here in BC. He's an economist in the States. And he talked about it being a housing crisis. It's not a bubble. The reason it's not a bubble is because people have a lot of cash. Some people have a lot of money. And what will happen is those who actually need their homes for their property to live in are going to lose it, and people with this exorbitant amount of money are going to move in and buy it all. So it's going to exacerbate a problem that is already bad. So and that's just one sector of the economy. So raising interest rates would have a negative effect on the people that you actually want to see risen, doing better in the economy. Yes, and I was going to say, and again, DT is right here with in response to Barry's response or question, and I think I sort of alluded to that earlier in one of my answers, and that is that government can print money and put it into the economy. At the same time, right now we have these the gouging of they're going to continue to gouge. That's that's the problem, and they're going to continue to destroy our environment as long as they're allowed to do this. So true that it's not so much that the government needs the money, but we certainly have to stop them from doing what they're doing. And I don't think, I'm not sure, expropriation. It's not just taking the profits. It's actually taking over these businesses, and I think that that's a good idea as well. What we could do is close them down and actually have a green economy. This would be a good place to start. Close down the big offenders and use the wealth that is there and the infrastructure to change what we're doing with our the just transition to a green economy. So there are many things that could be done. As for China, I don't have a lot to say either about that because I'm not sure exactly, but I mentioned Michael Hudson before, and one of the things that he's consulting with the Chinese government, and so that they are not going to financialize their economy. They're going to have an economy based on goods and services for the people, and this is very important. So he's over there on an ongoing basis, as far as I know, helping them out so that they don't make the mistakes that we've made here in North America.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. So we're going to go back to our technical producer for our last 4 questions. And this time you will only have 5 minutes to answer one or all of the 4 questions. And we will start with DT, then Stephen, and then Bob. Dave?
The first question is, does the ruling class have control of the economy? The second question is, since mainstream economics education is so divorced from reality, how can someone learn real economics? The third question is, what will inflation mean to people on low income or fixed income? The fourth question is, can financialization not be described as the flight of capital into real estate values in response to the state's gratuitous printing of funny money, ergo the huge jump in housing prices?
Thank you. DT, 5 minutes.
So does the ruling class have control of the economy? Well, yes and no. They make many of the decisions about how the corporations will be run. They're the executives, they're the shareholders, they're the asset managers, they're the elephants stomping around, but also no, because the production is largely in our hands, and we are indispensable for making sure that it operates. So they have control in the sense of, through their ownership, they get to decide how assets get used. I'm an adherent of the early 20th century thinker Thorstein Veblen. He made an important distinction between business and industry. And a lot of the thinking about capitalism was based on a misidentification of it with industry rather than with business. So we have industry, which is all of the productive capacity, and then you have business, which under capitalism controls that industry and makes the decisions about how it will be used. And Veblen used the term sabotage to refer to how business deals with industry. It's because of the property rights that business holds over industry that basically they can turn the tap off whenever they want, in order to make us scream and capitulate and pay our tribute to them. So we are the industry, but business exercises control over that. Since mainstream economics education is so divorced from reality, how can someone learn real economics? Well, as I mentioned before, take Chomsky's advice, read the business press. It's really one of the best places you can turn to find out what's actually going on. follow me on Twitter. I share lots of stuff that has to do with what's really happening in economics, and will occasionally point at good theory. I mentioned a comrade of mine, Blair Fix. Follow him. He does incredible empirical work. So there is good stuff that's happening out there, and you just need to be turned towards it. And I also think the edifice of dominant mainstream economics is crumbling. There are more challenges to it being espoused within mainstream media than there has been in my adult lifetime. What will inflation mean for people on low income or fixed income? It will be devastating, because, as mentioned, research has shown that generally in periods of inflation, keeping in mind all of that variation that exists under the headline CPI number, inflation is generally higher for people who are poor. The goods that they typically consume tend to rise more than other goods. Can financialization not be described as the flight of capital into real estate values? Yeah, I don't really get the premise of this. I will mention that generally, I don't like the term financialization. I prefer the term assetization. I think the term financialization emerged out of the misidentification of capitalism as a system of production rather than as a system of ownership and control. It has always been a financial system. Business always understood its relationship to industry via financial values. What you have seen is a massive explosion in what has become an asset that can be owned and claimed for a revenue stream that it will provide, like long-term care. So Canadians for Tax Fairness just put out a report showing that over the 10 years before the pandemic, for-profit long-term care in Ontario extracted $3.8 billion in public funding. That is the assetization of long-term care. This was once a thing that was provided by not-for-profit and public institutions, and now for-profit institutions want to own this as an asset because it can provide them with yield. The state spending money into the economy should not be blamed for what is happening. Could it drive up asset prices? Certainly, because of the trickle-up economy. So it's profit and interest controlled by corporations that is ultimately driving up these asset prices, not public institutions spending money where it needs to be spent. All of this said, them spending the money into the economy certainly could have an inflationary effect. So for example, let's say the government prioritized getting people with physical disabilities jobs. They are incredibly overrepresented among unemployed people. And so and there's plenty of work to be done that they could be doing. The private sector is not hiring them for all kinds of reasons. So let's say that the government says, well, we're going to have our public institutions make sure that these people can contribute in the way that many of them certainly want to be contributing and providing them with income. I just learned recently that there is a ton of concentration in the wheelchair business. So if you need a replacement battery, it's incredibly expensive and it can take a long time to acquire. So let's say the people with physical disabilities are demanding more batteries. The battery supply is constrained because of corporate control. You could see the prices rising. But the response isn't to cut public funding or raise interest rates. It's to build more wheelchair factories, wheelchair battery manufacturing factories to increase the supply. So we need to know more about the specifics about where the inflation is actually coming from to answer these questions. Aggregate level analysis can only get us so far. There's so much more that needs to be understood that we don't understand because of mainstream economics. Mainstream pundits have been so hyper-focused on the headline CPI numbers.
Thank you. Okay, we'll go to Stephen.
Okay, so I'll try and add a little bit to these. The ruling class have control over the economy. Yes, I think DT answered that. I'll just say that part of the problem here is that we have power that we are not exercising both as workers and as consumers. So I think that's the part that that we've a lot of that has to do with reduced unionization, of course, and maybe too much advertising. They advertise it. If we really wanted all these products so badly, why do they have to advertise the hell out of them in order to get us to buy them? So I think that we need to be more informed about what power we actually have, and not give way to the control that the ruling class has exerted increasingly, especially since the 1980s, on our economy. We've basically been told that and accepted that we have such limited power, and that's not really true. So, of course, I'd like to see workers unite and take over what the economy is for the benefit of all of us. So, mainstream economics, yes. Again, the one thing I would add to this, there are many different sources, but I would say also joint socialist action. We've got some pretty good ideas going on here. So that would be one thing I would suggest. Inflation means, yes, again, this is something that's already happening. It's impacting people of low and fixed incomes for sure, and will continue to do so at a disproportionately in comparison to the wealthier people. I mean, when you have excess wealth, you can absorb inflation. When you're on a shoestring, that shoestring is going to snap. So I think that's what a lot of people on low and fixed income are up against right now. Question, did I miss one? No, okay. And then the fourth question here. Yeah, not alone. I would say that certainly, this is about financialization and the flight of capital into real estate, increasing the costs there. I seldom refer to real estate values. I think of them as being costs, because for the most part, that's what they are for people. Yeah, not alone, I wouldn't say. But of course, that money that has been gathered goes somewhere, and one of the places it's gone is into housing. So certainly there's global capital that has driven up the housing prices. There's no doubt about that. Housing property has become part of the portfolios of the rich. So certainly it has had its influence. I find it interesting, the assetization of the economy, and I'm not an economist, but when I talk about financialization of the market or the economy, I think of it as being money making money, where you don't even necessarily, and so I think assets can be a part of that, where you're not contributing anything. You're just making money on that asset. But I see financialization as being something that is like money as an asset, you might say, so that you're not really doing anything, absolutely nothing. You don't even have an asset, a physical asset. You have money that is making more money. So I don't know whether DT would agree with that, but I'll tell you, DT, I'll take a lesson from you anytime, okay? I'll end it there.
Okay, thank you. Bob?
Bob, you're muted. Are you able to unmute, Bob?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'll go for number 4. I mean, financialization is a problem in housing. It has nothing to do with funny money. Again, I'd insist, back in the 70s, capitalists will go wherever they can make profit. Back in the 70s, it was more profitable to invest in what they call a fire sector: finance, insurance, and real estate. So they found out that housing and these big asset companies like BlackRock owns shares in almost every company in the world. They're pulling the money of billionaires, and they're looking for income streams from asset acquisitions. So, they've discovered that housing and rentals can be an asset stream. They just buy it and then they go to sleep as the rents or housing payments come in. That's a definition of rentier capitalism that every economist from Adam Smith through to Marx and Keynes called for the euthanasia of the rentier class. I mean, the aristocrats used to sleep at night, and their farms would keep growing and making them rich. It's a casino. It's nothing productive. It doesn't produce goods and services. It just produces income streams, paper money. So rental housing has become a new and really lucrative financial asset class. It's equity funds, but there's contradictions. Even our pension funds, it might be a union pension fund, but they're involved in this too. I mean, in order to provide pensions for their members, they have to maximize the profits of the pension fund. They're involved in this too. So, and tax treatment. Like we don't have pensions like we used to, so a lot of us know about mutual funds and Canadian tax treatment. If you look at, they're called rights, real estate. I don't know. It's basically a housing ETF or a mutual fund. They get favorable tax treatment, for buying up housing. And these companies are able to raise cash cheaply on capital markets instead of relying on mortgage and all that. With their digital technology, they can scan what's for sale, be the first to scoop it in, make the best bid. And they have a real advantage over the smaller investors. So Wall Street landlords or the equity funds see in the single family rental the ingredients for a real novel financial asset. The aggregate ownership, bundles of rent checks could replace bundles of mortgage checks. It's a model of securitization suited to a post-ownership society. The sale of these financial assets to bondholders allows landlords to borrow against the value of the properties. This is 208 all over again, really. I mean, we know about the CDOs and all that financial engineering of the 208. It's back. It's back in car loans, student loans, and back in housing. It's from shadow banks now, and some of the big commercial banks have failed. And talk about Airbnb. I mean, some cities like have limited Airbnb to rooms in your own house. Here, people are buying houses just for rentals to, it's a significant chunk. But the main problem is, financialization. I mean, a house is both a use value, you live in, it's an exchange value, a market value. And the market value is becoming predominant. I mean, housing went up 30% during the pandemic. It's nuts. Yeah, I think I'll drop it there because the other answers have been good already. Yeah, the other answers have been good.
Okay, thank you, Bob. And in fact, a special thanks to all of our panelists, to DT, Stephen, and Bob, and to our technical producer, Dave Enning in Toronto, and to Barry Weisletter, who's the political producer of the webcast. So if you would like to talk to us about joining SA, write to socialistactioncanada@gmail.com or give us a call at 647-986-1917. That's 647-986-1917. The show has been recorded and can be seen on the Socialist Action YouTube channel. The next webcast, folks, will be the SA International Education Conference on Saturday, June the 4th, starting at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And there are 3 sessions. The 1 p.m. Eastern Time, a short history of the international workers' movement. It will include an account of the first 4 Worker International. And the speaker will be Jeff Mackler, National Secretary of SA USA. At 4 p.m., Marxism and the National Question. Look at the differences between the nationalism of oppressed nations and the nationalism of oppressor nations and the related principles and tactics of socialists. The speaker will be Barry Weisletter. And 7 p.m., the United Front. It will examine the approach of revolutionaries to coalition and common front, organizing on a variety of social justice issues, both foreign and domestic, and in relations to unions, the NDP, and municipal politics. The speakers will include John Clark, Daniel Terade, and Florentia Shade. That's on Saturday, June the 4th, starting at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. The Zoom link is on the Socialist Action website. So, in the meantime, please be safe, stay healthy, and stay active. Bye for now.